my first talk, I looked at the historical development of watercolour painting and the composition of watercolour in my second talk. With these two talks in mind, I would now like to explore what makes watercolour a modern fine art medium and show that if it had not been for technological discoveries and developments, this may not have been possible. Prior to the 19th century, artists had to make their own colours using simple hand grinding equipment, using materials purchased from an apothecary. The first commercial European watercolours were produced in the 18th century and consisted of a hard block which required considerable rubbing to dissolve in water. The invention of the collapsible metal tube and the use of ingredients that retained moisture in the paint formulation by Messrs. Winsor and Newton allowed art material manufacturers to supply watercolours in liquid form, which was easier to use, and with the introduction of mechanical grinding, the watercolours became more transparent due to the pigment's smaller particle size. Our definition of watercolour now as a fine art medium is a little different to the definition of artists that used it before the 19th century. Modern watercolourists take for granted the techniques that were developed during the 19th century, which was only possible with the introduction of moist watercolours. Then these new revolutionary techniques of overlaying thin, transparent washes that relied on the white of the paper for their effect, or wet in wet techniques, which worked well because of the increased solubility due to the use of humectants, are seen today as the unique quality that gives watercolour its charm and freshness as a fine art medium. Today, watercolour is generally defined as a traditional transparent technique, working from light to dark and using the white of the paper to provide the highlights in the painting. However, during its heyday in the mid-19th century, the majority of watercolour artists during this time were using a mixture of transparent and opaque effects, which is often frowned upon today as not being pure watercolour. Opaque watercolours are often referred to as gouache or body colour, which is not strictly true. Gouache is often defined as using white to achieve opacity in water-based colours, but opacity can also be achieved by using an opaque pigment and applying the colour in a concentrated way. By using white to achieve opacity, the opaque watercolour will have greater brightness and intensity, and if highly pigmented, will have good colour strength and a degree of transparency when painted out in thin washes. Gouache watercolours produce a flat, uniform area of colour, which was why they were popular with designers and illustrators. However, despite their opacity, gouache can be applied thinly in transparent or semi-transparent washes. But when used like this, they appear less brilliant than high-quality transparent watercolours. Although gouache is a form of watercolour, the painting style is more akin to oil painting, going from dark to light, which is opposite to using transparent watercolour. Painting with gouache is popular in China, as the Chinese fine art students studying oil painting use them as an alternative in the classroom because they are quicker than oils to dry, which is great in an exam situation, and obviously do not smell of linseed oil. Since the mid-19th century, watercolours have been supplied to artists in two physical states, in a moist liquid form and a solid cake in a pan. The pan colours available today are related to the solid watercolours of the past, but changes to their formulations ensure that they have improved solubility when used. Their formulations are similar to the watercolours supplied in tubes, except they contain very little or no water, and many artists prepare their own pan colours by emptying the tubes in small dishes and allowing them to dry out before use. The preference of pan or tube is based on personal choice, as both have their advantages and disadvantages. It is often remarked that pan colours have more pigment in them. In one way, this is true, as the dried colour is more concentrated, and so they tend to be sold in smaller amounts and relatively more expensive than the same tube colour. However, the ratio of pigment to binder, which is usually the same as in tubes, is the most important factor, as this will dictate the amount of pigment in the dried film. So with all things being equal in the finished painting, it makes no difference whether pans or tubes are used. Although just words to describe watercolour, professional, artist and student, their use conjures up meaning with respect to quality. It wasn't that long ago when artist watercolours denoted the highest quality range in an art material manufacturer's product portfolio, and student, or a range named after a famous watercolourist, announced the next quality range. In some cases there was a third quality that was primarily aimed at children and for educational use. Rightly or wrongly, in today's market, the name artists' watercolours has been used to describe watercolours of all qualities, and so there has been a need to once again distinguish the highest quality watercolour ranges available, and so some manufacturers, AJ Ludlow included, use the term professional to mean the very best. A true professional watercolour range is one where each colour is loaded with high quality pigment, and so are intense, bright on drying, and due to the amount of pigment tend to be used more dilute and so tend to go further. Each colour in the range should be permanent and be single pigmented for brilliance that remains even in colour mixes. It should be re-wettable even after drying and flow and be a joy to paint with. There is a formulation difference between student and artist professional grades, which does affect how they perform. There are obvious differences between brands, where some student grades perform better than others, and some artist grades have similar performance to the better student ones. But when compared to a true high quality professional watercolour, the result is like chalk and cheese. The student grades tend to have the same powder to binder ratio but contain less pigment, which means the space is taken up with extenders that are sometimes referred to as fillers but may be regarded as very weak white pigments. When the student watercolours dry, they are less intense and duller than the high quality grades. In some cases there is a colour shift on drying to a slightly lighter shade. In my opinion, student grade watercolours are harder to use and the results are less fulfilling than using professional ones, which all in all is an unnecessary hurdle when you are just starting out painting. The quality and permanence of the pigments are also reduced in student grades, and in education and children's products even lower. Light fastness in the lower quality products is not needed, and so the pigments used tend to be similar to the cheaper pigments used for printing packaging. They are bright, have strong tinting strengths, so they can be used in small amounts but fade relatively quickly. Sometimes, by just looking at the packaging and painting these colours out, it is quite difficult to gauge their quality, and when the artwork starts to fade, it really is too late.